Hello, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to this seminar. This is actually the second in a series of public seminars that the GSDRC is organizing this year and into next year. This seminar series is supported by DFID as part of DFID's professional development activities for its own staff, which include a whole series of reading packs and lectures, short e-learning courses, and other kinds of publications. Our first event of this kind was held in London in the spring. Then this one and the next one are going to be here in Birmingham, and then we'll have others in other locations. Because this event is intended to be used by DFID staff for professional development purposes, we are going to be video recording it. The microphone will pick up Professor Sriram's voices, but it won't pick up yours if you're not standing near a microphone. But we are recording it, and the recording will be later made available on our website as part of the professional development work for DFID. I would also like to ask you please to turn off your mobiles so that it doesn't interfere with the recording. You know how mobiles sound when they trigger a loudspeaker, right? So thank you all for coming. Chandra Sriram is a professor of international law and international relations at the University of East London and co-director of the Center on Human Rights in Conflict, which is an interdisciplinary center that carries out academic and policy-oriented research in situations of conflict and situations in transition from authoritarian regimes. She's published widely in international law, international relations, human rights, and other subject areas, and is currently working on a major project on the impact of transitional justice measures on democratic institution building. Professor Sriram will begin by making a presentation for about 35, 40 minutes, thereabouts, and then we'll open the floor to questions both from the live audience here and from the online audience who are invited to send in questions via Twitter, hashtag GSDRC seminar, or via the discussion forum that's on our website. Professor Chandra Sriram.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation, and to all of you for taking the time on a lovely afternoon to actually come and listen to me talk about this stuff. My task today is really not a small one. It's to try and put questions of responses to mass atrocities and serious human rights abuses into the context of how we manage serious violent conflict, recognizing at the same time the need not just to engage in conflict resolution, post-conflict peace building, but also to manage the needs of development as well. I'll say a little bit more about my background just so you understand how I come to these issues, although I think the introduction was quite clear. It is that my background is one of both international politics and international law, and that my work has always been at the intersection of conflict prevention, conflict resolution, post-conflict peace building, alongside international human rights law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and the subfield known as transitional justice. In this context, as has been explained, a lot of the work that I do is academically focused, but it is also very much focused on the ways in which insights from academic work can be utilized by different kinds of practitioners across the fields that I work in. I should also say that as I approach these questions, I do so not only from this interdisciplinary background, but also from a field research background. Most of my research is also based in a variety of different countries across South Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit of work in the Middle East and North Africa, and my current project also has me working for the first time in East Asia and Eastern Europe. So at this point, I think I might be a dilettante for about every region in the world. That said, what I'm trying to do is take political and legal research out of abstraction and put it in the field and really try to connect the two. So what am I going to be getting at today? At some level, probably what I'm going to be talking about should be pretty obvious or at least intuitive to all of you, but I want to try and break it down a little bit. At this point, I think we all recognize the relationships between serious abuses, armed conflict, and development. For example, if we only have to think about the 2011 World Bank World Development Report, which really spelled out in sharp relief the ways in which armed conflict affects development in countries around the world, right? And similarly, major reports by the UN Secretary General in 2004 and 2011 highlighted the importance of responding to past abuses in conflict-affected countries, focusing particularly on rule of law and transitional justice. So the idea that these things are connected is no longer new. A decade ago, I was saying that it really was, because it was. Really, people weren't making these connections in ways that they needed to do. And of course, you'll all be familiar most recently, as of September, the UN Sustainable Development Summit, where Goal 16, which is on the promotion of just, peaceful, and inclusive societies, heavily highlighted the promotion of rule of law, combating corruption, and reduction of violence, including that of torture, as well as greater protection of fundamental freedom. So again, connecting peace and conflict, development, and dealing with serious human rights abuses, right? So the convergence of these goals and challenges of conflict management, response to mass atrocities, human rights violations, and development has never been more clear, I would say, than it is now in these kinds of policy documents. But what does it mean in practice? And this is the task that I'm going to take up today. First, and I've already alluded to this, it's not always been the case that the connections between these fields and activities has been evident either to scholars or practitioners. For a variety of reasons, including disciplinary backgrounds, professional biases, institutional habits, and stovepiping, what we've seen is that quite frequently practitioners of conflict resolution and peace building, or of human rights and international criminal justice, or of transitional justice, or of development, have really viewed one another either as simply not related to the work that one was doing, or as potentially competitive or conflictual with one's own primary goals. And yet today what we actually see is that responding to mass atrocities and serious human rights abuses is no longer just the task of lawyers and human rights advocates, right? Instead, it's now also the task of peacemakers and peace builders and development actors. And they converge not only around really visible legalized responses such as criminal trials or rule of law reform, but also broader questions of reconciliation, reparations, truth-telling, rebuilding of communities, and much more. So I want to say a word about mass atrocities, but I'm going to broaden out the topic to serious human rights abuses, as well as human rights abuses that may be viewed as somewhat on the margin, because I think these are actually essential for the kinds of interconnections that I'm trying to get at. So mass atrocities can be things that are often the most visible. These are really the serious violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law violations that tend to draw our attention, such as, for example, the alleged use both by the Syrian government and now by so-called Islamic State of chemical weapons in Syria, ethnic cleansing in the wars of the former Yugoslavia, or alleged crimes against humanity in Kenya following the 2007 elections. And that's because of their very shocking nature or scale, because of the visibility. And I'm not in any way saying that these aren't important, but I think it's also essential to look at other elements of human rights violations. But to be precise, what are mass atrocities before we move on to sort of broadening this out? Legally speaking, usually what we're talking about are core international crimes, specifically genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. These are the crimes that are also fully codified in the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. They're also, in legal terms, understood as jus cogens crimes. That is to say, they are violations of obligations from which no state can derogate. So it doesn't matter if you are a party to the Rome Statute or not. You still have obligations not to engage in these kinds of violations. And indeed, you may have obligations not only to do that, but also to prevent or punish or extradite if you're not willing to punish where someone is in your jurisdiction who is alleged to have been responsible. It's essential to understand that these kinds of violations, these mass atrocities, core international crimes, are different from some other violations of human rights. A variety of civil and political rights, for example, actually can be derogated in times of emergency or conflict, with limits, with justifications, and usually also with temporal limits. So it's not to say that anything goes, but many other human rights violations may be permissible in relatively limited ways in certain contexts, right? So here is where mass atrocities differ. But it is really important to understand that beyond mass atrocities, many other human rights abuses are committed in these kinds of contexts, and these include a wide range of civil and political rights violations, as well as, and we often forget about these, economic, social, and cultural rights violations. At the same time, there's a wide range of responses to mass atrocities and these other human rights abuses carried out by national and international actors, also by local actors, including through traditional justice. But most frequently what we see are international criminal justice and transitional justice. And I'm going to say a little bit further on about how these relate to each other and how they're different, because at this point I think we often conflate the two, and they actually do have different sources and potentially different functions. Again, to highlight, traditionally development actors haven't been directly involved with these kinds of legalized processes, but they now increasingly are because of the other kinds of work that they do. For a start, that is to say support to rule of law promotion, security sector reform, and other kinds of programming, and in some cases also because development actors are increasingly also providing direct support to different kinds of domestic transitional justice processes. So it is important to understand what the connections are between these human rights abuses and mass atrocities and how they relate to questions of peace and development. It's also important to understand what the mechanisms are that currently exist to respond to these kinds of abuses and to openly recognize the ways in which they may either help or hinder peace and development promotion, okay? So the first thing that we're going to want to understand, and I'll come to this in more detail in a minute, are the ways in which serious human rights abuses and mass atrocities are both a consequence of violent conflict, but also frequently a cause, right? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And because, in fact, we see this kind of circular or feedback effect, it's essential to understand that failure to actually address these kinds of atrocities is more than a matter of a moral compunction or a legal requirement. It also relates to very serious concerns about how we go about preventing future conflicts, how we go about building peace, how we go about looking at developing, well, encouraging stable and sustainable development. So in this talk, I'm going to basically outline 3 critical topics for those who are concerned with conflict, peace building, and development in the context of dealing with mass atrocities and serious human rights violations. And these basically track, don't worry, there are only 2 slides. And these bullets basically are just to tell you, and I apologize, you can see them there, just to tell you the 3 major topics that I'm going to cover. The first is really about the relationship between human rights abuses and violent conflict, and the need also perhaps to attend more carefully to economic, social, and cultural rights violations, in addition to the host of other concerns that we more regularly are used to addressing. The second is really to get to grips with what the range of international policy responses are, which include, as I've already noted, international criminal law and transitional justice, but also range much more widely than that. And finally, and this is, I know, a critical concern for development actors, but should be for all of us, the challenges that we actually have in assessing the efficacy of any of the measures that we're talking about, right? Do we actually know that this stuff does what it says on the tin? Do we know what the side effects are? Do we know that the additional broader and broader goals that are often adduced for a whole host of measures are actually accurate, right? So. To the first topic, which is this question of interconnection. What are the connections? Now, again, a lot of this may seem transparently obvious, but it's worth sort of breaking down a little bit. Again, not only is it the case that mass atrocities and human rights violations are frequently the most visible consequence of violent conflict, and this is frequently the case because so many contemporary internal armed conflicts involve pretty much all parties to the conflict deliberately targeting civilians, right? So in fact, we see this real spike in atrocities, or at least the visibility of them, in a lot of contemporary armed conflicts. However, they are also potentially some of the underlying sources, right? So I want to sort of talk through that a little bit. First of all, ongoing and previous abuses may also be motivators for conflict, right? And many different armed groups and combatants will say, look, we're fighting to protect either the whole of the country, our people, or they'll actually be fighting to protect only particular constituents and particular groups. But either way, they're often also evoking questions of past abuses, right? Either to exact revenge or make claims more broadly about justice. And these can be invoked really genuinely or quite cynically by political leaders and so on. So easy examples are in the former Yugoslavia, claims that were made during the wars in the former Yugoslavia about past abuses by Croatian collaborators with Axis-era powers during World War II, right? So evoking, obviously, alleged abuses from decades before. But it goes back further than that, right? We'll all be familiar that in the run-up to the conflict in Kosovo, Slobodan Milosevic also invoked the Battle of Kosovo of 1389, right? So you can see that often, and the massacres that took place therein. So you can see that, in fact, one of the real challenges is that all kinds of claims about past abuses can help to justify or provoke contemporary violence and further abuses, right? And in fact, it goes further than that, because we also find that the fact of these abuses and failure to respond to them can help make conflict resolution that much harder, right? And this is because there will be disputes over whether abuses happened at all. There will be disputes over who actually bears responsibility for any particular event, and very much increasing disputes over what types of accountability, if any at all, will be acceptable. Now, this all comes in the context frequently of attempts at conflict resolution, right? So we're not talking about attempting to, say, negotiate a peace agreement in some kind of vacuum. We're talking about negotiating a peace agreement in which various actors to the conflict may have committed atrocities and be desirous of protecting themselves, may believe that other parties committed atrocities and be desirous of seeing them punished, but not themselves, and in which almost everyone may have a stake in not talking about past abuses as well. So the classic example now, and everyone has a different take on this, of course, were the Juba peace negotiations for northern Uganda, right? Where many people have alleged two very different stories. One is that, in fact, the unsealing of the arrest warrants for Joseph Kony and other leaders of the Lord's Resistance Army helped to push the LRA to the negotiating table. However, there's a very different story which says, well, they got to the negotiation table, but then the problem was, in fact, this question of accountability, and that was the deal killer, right? That's why you actually reach a sort of agreement at Juba, most of which is never implemented, right? So there are very serious concerns as one thinks about conflict management, conflict resolution, about what to do about past abuses. So obviously, mass atrocities such as genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity often draw the greatest attention. They're the ones that we see on our television screens. They're the ones that we see in the news. They're the ones that we see as potentially most important because they're the ones that can be tried by the International Criminal Court. At the same time, there are also frequent expectations that we will respond rapidly. That is to say, many people will say, justice deferred is justice denied, or variations on that kind of theme, and really want to see accountability as quickly as possible. I would say both of these are truths, but perhaps overstated truths. And I'll come to what I mean by this. First of all, in terms of how soon justice happens or has to happen, the reality is it's often quite slow, it's often quite iterated, and it's not ever very well planned. And that's just a fact of life. So those of us who are thinking about doing conflict resolution and development have to deal with the fact that it's somewhat unpredictable because it is subject to the vagaries of politics, and processes and possibilities change over time. So if you take, for example, Argentina, with the transition from authoritarian rule and the end of the so-called Dirty War in 1983, we saw prosecutions, and we in fact saw 5 of the 9 members of the military junta that had run the country being convicted. A whole series of things happened, and they were ultimately pardoned, and there were questions about disruption and the danger to democracy and lots of other things. But then in the sort of later early 2000s, so in the sort of last 5-10 years, we saw a revival of prosecutions, again in Argentina. Right, what does this tell us? Well, you don't just get one bite at the apple. There's probably another round to come. And similarly, I do a lot of work in Sri Lanka, and of course, there the war ended in 2009, formally speaking, with a great number of claims about atrocities and very little action. Well, now we're actually starting to see movement at the UN Human Rights Council and amongst a wide variety of actors reopening the question of accountability, now already some 6 years after the end of the war, right? So we have to be a little bit realistic about when these things happen. At the same time, it's important to understand, and I think we're only starting to see this on our news screens now, war crimes themselves are actually more than bodily harm, right? This is what we usually think about. They can also include things like spoliation, specifically pillage or plunder, often of natural resources, also destruction of cultural and religious property. So I think everyone will have seen repeated videos of destruction of the various ruins at Palmyra by so-called Islamic State. I think this is one of the sort of first moments in which we've collectively had our attention drawn to this, perhaps also the Buddhas in Afghanistan and their destruction previously. But interestingly, alongside that, and there hasn't been much discussion about this, just in the last week, the very first defendant who has actually been charged with destruction of cultural property as a war crime has reached the International Criminal Court. His name is Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi, and he is charged with his responsibility in the destruction of 9 mausoleums and a mosque in Timbuktu in Mali during the conflict there. So I think we're about to see a much more rich discussion about what mass atrocities mean, including what war crimes mean, because of this. It's not an expansion. This has always been present in international humanitarian law. We saw elements of this actually even in the Nuremberg trials. This is the first time in any contemporary sense that we're seeing this being taken up again. So I think that may be quite interesting. And again, relevant particularly for peace building and development actors who either are concerned about the symbolic meaning, the ways in which destruction of cultural property may also destroy communities, which very much changes what a development agenda can be, and so on. But it is important to remember that not all human rights violations will constitute mass atrocities. And that doesn't mean they're not important when we think about conflict management and peace building and development. Right, they're still critical in conflict-affected countries. And these are obviously civil and political rights violations, but also economic, social, and cultural rights violations more broadly. So for example, violations of civil and political rights, including denial of freedom of expression or religion or political participation, frequently do underpin conflict. They form really important grievances for those who may engage in peaceful protest, but may also engage in violent protest. And I think we have only to think about recent experiences from the so-called Arab Spring, which have sort of generated both inspirational moments of protest, but also really tragic developments. If we think about the devolution of peaceful protest in Syria to the current civil war that we see. I'm not saying that some of the original grievances were only civil and political rights, or that protests necessarily had to devolve into civil war, but that we need to recognize that these kinds of grievances have the potential to develop into more violent conflict. And similarly, if you think about Kenya, which is another place that I conduct research, a mixture of spontaneous protests and orchestrated violence and police excesses resulted in some 1,300 deaths in just a couple of months, with hundreds of thousands of people displaced. And this was purely about whether or not the election had been stolen, right, at least in the first instance. At the same time, violations of economic, social, cultural rights or infliction of economic harms, theft of property, as well as corruption often precede and attend violent conflict. So again, if we think about the so-called Arab Spring, the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia over economic issues helped to spark both peaceful protest in the country, peaceful protest in other countries in the region, but unfortunately in other countries also we saw a devolution into more violent conflict. So it is important for us to understand that these economic rights violations can help generate or spark conflict, as well as be a consequence of conflict, and that many economic violations will also help to be drivers of conflict to the degree that they help to fund it. What this means is that post-conflict peace and development activities need to attend not just to questions of whether or not there's grievous bodily harm to individuals, although that is very important, but to the moral and political and material consequences of a whole host of economic violations as well. Because these can have quite long-term effects, really obvious things like what happens in the context of people being displaced from their homes, what happens in the context of land grabbing, how do you reconstruct in those ways, in those contexts. And one of the reasons that this is actually something that I wanted to highlight is because, in fact, I think we attend to these issues much less in conflict-affected countries, perhaps as a sort of artifact of the way in which human rights advocacy has worked, which is itself an artifact of the Cold War, right? So historically, the strongest international human rights movements, as we know, have come from the West, and the prioritization has been very much of civil and political rights over economic, social, and cultural rights. Again, this is, in a sense, an artifact of the Cold War. I'm not saying that one is more important than the other, but I think we need to understand why it is the prioritization still looks the way that it does, okay? And indeed, in the context of transitional justice, which I'll come to in a bit, there is now a very lively debate about whether or not transitional justice processes should not only address past economic harms and abuses and violations, but whether it should also be viewed as an engine for development, right? Whether, in fact, it should be in service of development. So I want to come now to part 2, which is, broadly speaking, international policy responses, right? What have we been up to in the sense of responding to mass atrocities and serious human rights abuses, and how do they actually then relate to questions of conflict management and development? There are really 2 major sets of processes that I want to point to, and I think we often conflate them in part because they're starting to converge themselves. The first is transitional justice, and the second is international criminal law, okay? And as I say, they are increasingly converging in conflict-affected countries, but they can and should be distinguished in terms of the history of how the process is developed, the kinds of mechanisms that get used, in some cases, the legal sources as well. So transitional justice processes, and I'm simplifying a great deal, as you can imagine here, involve largely, historically speaking, domestic responses to past abuses, but they do include a wide variety of mechanisms, right? Everything from criminal prosecutions to a whole host of non-criminal processes, whether it's commissions of inquiry and truth-telling, whether it's vetting, whether it's reparations, whether it's memorials, and indeed whether it's amnesties. And at the same time that we have these multiple processes, they're also frequently expected to serve multiple goals. So in some cases, for example, criminal trials are expected to do very little more than serve the goal of retributive justice. That is to say, a crime has been committed, you can identify the perpetrator, you should have a trial, and you should have a fair trial, right? That seems relatively straightforward. Of course, it turns out not to be for a whole host of reasons, including the difficulty of getting good evidence out of conflict situations. But it seems simple in comparison to the many other claims that are also attributed to transitional justice, such as deterrence of future abuses, such as promotion of rule of law in a post-transition society, promotion of democracy and human rights, addressing the needs of victims, and indeed even peace building, right? These are really big claims that get made. So advocates of domestic trials, for example, have said much more than that they simply address the fact that there was a crime committed and we have a potential perpetrator in front of us. They also say, well, no, this will actually help to deter future abusers because it will show them that impunity is no longer possible, right? They won't now think that they can actually get away with these things, right? And in the context of Kenya, again, for example, lots of people domestically said, look, this will start to take away this sort of mystique of the big man thesis, right? The idea that there are people who can simply evade responsibility because of the nature of the power that they hold, right? There are also claims that, in fact, rule of law and democracy will be promoted through demonstration effect, right? Having fair trials will show us that it's actually possible in a society in which it's not historically been possible. These claims were particularly strong in the Latin American context during the transitions of the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. And at the same time, many countries will actually see demands for amnesty, right? Which both foreclose prosecution, but interestingly, sometimes do other things, right? They're often used to enable peace agreements and political settlements. And they also, in many cases, include or enable the return of political exiles and release of political prisoners. So as part of my current project, I'm working also in Brazil and Chile, and in both countries, The interesting thing is that while the amnesty was utilized in some ways and in some cases for basically shielding perpetrators, in Brazil in particular, this was something that was advocated. The amnesty was advocated by civil society because they wanted to get political prisoners out. They wanted to enable people who had been exiled and denied the possibility of jobs. They wanted to allow them to return. And for those of you who don't know this, of course, the current president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, was herself a political prisoner, benefited from, in fact, amnesty and more importantly, the reparations processes that followed. So the idea there is that somehow different kinds of processes can help promote these different kinds of goals: democracy, human rights, peacemaking. The same types of goals are expected from a lot of the other mechanisms as well. Commissions of inquiry are expected to do more than just tell us what happened in the past or possibly tell us who did it. They're also expected to generate a kind of political exclusion for some of those who were abusers so that they can't do it again. As is vetting, which may actually explicitly remove them or bar them from public office. And similarly, reparations and restorative justice measures and memorials are expected to do a lot more than just serve what victims say their needs are, questions of recognition and so on, but also to mitigate the likelihood that victims and others will want to engage in revenge, right? So the idea is that these are also potentially conflict mitigating strategies. At least that's the claim. What's important to note here is that all of these activities intersect in really complex ways with both peace building and development activities, because they're taking place on the terrain of conflict-affected countries where you have huge numbers of other kinds of international actors, including development actors, including peace building actors, who may or may not be engaged directly with, say, an activity like reparations, but will be working alongside them, oftentimes with some of the same beneficiaries, right? So if you think, for example, in Sierra Leone about the scale of development assistance to communities that were affected by the conflict, in many cases they'll be working alongside or intersecting with reparations programs that are dealing with those who were specifically physically harmed by the conflict or who are dealing with emotional trauma. And in many cases, rather curiously, and this is something I found a lot in my research in Sierra Leone, some of the beneficiaries actually don't know the difference. They just know that more internationals are coming in with money, and they're actually not quite clear what the goal is or who people are. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's something to be aware of, right? Because these activities are happening in this kind of simultaneous way, as I say, on the same terrain, with and for many of the same people. And this is perhaps compounded when reparations programs are so explicitly international. So for example, again, in Sierra Leone, the reparations programs have been funded almost entirely by the international community, right? By donations from governments, via the International Organization for Migration, or by programs that were specifically funded by UNIFEM and then UN Women. So again, all of these programs which engage in questions of livelihood support or support to communities and so on intersect in really interesting ways in peace-building activities, with peace-building activities and development activities. Now, much of the time, countries use a lot of these different mechanisms of transitional justice simultaneously, and I don't have time to go into it, but oftentimes there are 2 or 3 of these operating simultaneously or sequentially. And in some cases, we also see a kind of merging with what I'm going to talk about next, international criminal justice, through creations such as hybrid tribunals. I'm thinking here of the Special Court for Sierra Leone and the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, for example, which involve both international and domestic staff, right? But international criminal law is a distinct entity, and it is worth trying to understand that it is different, even though increasingly we sort of treat transitional justice and international criminal law as though they're the same thing. International criminal law involves individualized criminal responsibility for violations, usually by a fairly small number of people, not because there weren't necessarily a large number of people who were perpetrators, but because of the capacities of the institutions. And it is to do with only a few core international crimes, as I said at the beginning: genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, right? So of course we all now know the ICC as the first permanent international criminal court, but also the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, which preceded it. What's important about these is that they are institutions that are designed to address, first and foremost, very specific violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, both because legal violations have been committed and with a kind of larger normative assertion that the interests of humanity have in some sense been breached. So the entire international community has an interest in seeing these crimes committed, no matter where they take place, because of their nature, because of their severity. Interestingly, although many international criminal lawyers would prefer to treat international criminal law as in some sense pure, right? This is the law, politics is over there. In fact, increasingly what we see, particularly by advocates for international criminal justice processes, are claims that are just as broad as the ones that I've noted about transitional justice. That is to say, that international criminal tribunals can also serve the needs of peacemaking, peace building, rule of law, development, and human rights. For example, a former member of the prosecutorial staff at the ICTY famously wrote an article now about 15 years ago saying that the ICTY itself, so the Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, had helped to deter future abuses in the former Yugoslavia and then the subsequent successor states. More recently, the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, famously asserted that within 6 months he could end the war in northern Uganda. Now, I don't know how many people ever actually believed him on that, but it is important to understand that there have been these kind of repeated and direct connections between the idea of doing justice and making peace, and the idea that the connection is necessarily positive. Further, the concept of positive complementarity as it's been developed at the ICC has been designed to really start to develop the idea that having this very small number of trials in an international criminal court can also help to promote and provoke development of rule of law in the affected countries, in the situation countries, and potentially help to enable the countries themselves to pursue trials. So the rhetoric here is often quite strong, although interestingly, if you read the policy papers of the Office of the Prosecutor on this point and a number of other points, you also see them littered with comments like, the ICC is not a development agency. And that's because I think they started to recognize that many of the aspirations that they were putting out there, like the court could help develop rule of law in an affected country, were potentially overstated and creating hopes that the court simply couldn't deliver on. Now, it's important to recognize that these processes, I've described them as sort of processes, but they don't actually operate in a vacuum, right? Who's doing them, right? Clearly, a whole host of different actors are doing them. Notably domestic governments, notably civil society actors, both domestic and international. And of course, in addition to the institutions that the international criminalized institutions that I've talked about, also a wide variety of bilateral development actors and international organizations, right? Notably, for example, international and regional organizations such as the United Nations and European Union, which have increasingly developed principles and processes, not only to prevent or respond to mass atrocities, but also to specifically support different kinds of transitional justice processes and international criminal law. Now, what's interesting and still somewhat difficult about this is that even though they've elaborated more and more policy documents in this area, there's oftentimes relatively little clear, coherent connection. For example, within the UN, although there's an increased sort of rule of law architecture, and there's an increased set of policy documents on transitional justice, and there is obviously a huge peace-building infrastructure, the connections aren't always as clearly articulated as we might hope, right? So we are seeing increasingly elaborated documents, and when you look in the field, what you see is these things increasingly operate alongside one another, regardless. So you have only to think about, for example, the now closed peace-building mission following on the peacekeeping mission in Sierra Leone, where you saw a convergence of a lot of these activities, or human rights and rule of law missions, as in MONUC. So within the peacekeeping mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, again, you saw this kind of convergence. So those are the activities. The final thing that I want to get to is evidence, right? So I've given you now a whole series of activities and a whole series of broad claims about what these activities might be expected to do, right? What transitional justice or international criminal law might be, or in fact are frequently expected to do for peace, development, and human rights. And I think these linkages are incredibly important, and it's important not only to articulate them and say what we mean, but also to actually try and test them. This doesn't turn out to be easy, but it is important. And I would say for about the last 20 years, 20, 30 years, the field of transitional justice studies in particular was driven by a lot of people who came in with a normative agenda, and there's nothing wrong with that, but didn't necessarily either have the wherewithal or desire to actively or very rigorously test their claims and assumptions. Now, this is in part because of really valid beliefs that promoting human rights is a good thing, whether or not it actually does the other things you're asking for. But because of the increasingly elaborate claims that are made for these processes, we've started to see some real demands that actually the evidence be shown. And these demands have come both from social scientists, particularly quantitative social scientists, but also from the push for better monitoring and evaluation, better sort of evidence-based programming within the development community and also within a variety of other international actors. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we've actually been pushed more and more to ask ourselves, well, what is the relationship? Rather than just listening to the assertions, right? Pursuing accountability helps promote peace, because it does all the things I've already said. Pursuing accountability impedes peace, because of the things that I've said. Instead, what we're now being asked to do is actually try and figure out, well, is that actually what's happening, right? And if either thing is what's happening, why? So when we first saw these debates start to emerge out of transitions in Latin America, as I said, in the 1980s and so on, we saw pretty sort of polarized claims, right? If you have too many prosecutions in Argentina, the military will rise up and they will overthrow the new civilian government, period, right? That kind of assertion. If you have, and then this is into the 1990s, if you establish the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, it will prevent a peace agreement being reached for the former Yugoslavia, and it will prevent anything being implemented, right? Again, very blanket assertion. I've already made the point about Joseph Kony and the claims about the Juba peace agreement. Right, so these are very stark claims that, in fact, somehow pursuing accountability will impede peace. And at the same time, as we've seen, there are really strong claims that pursuing accountability will promote peace, right? You get perpetrators like Slobodan Milosevic out of the mix. You get Dominic Ongwen out of the mix, right? You physically remove them from the possibility that they can cause more trouble. You deter other actors, so on and so forth. So we've seen these kinds of claims, but the problem is the actual evidence of impact, either positive or negative, is actually really, really elusive, right? So there's a lot of good qualitative work, and I like to count myself as at least having done a lot of qualitative work. I won't tell you whether it's good or not, but there's a lot of qualitative work focusing on 1, 2, or 3 countries, really trying to trace, okay, this is the process that we think happened in Argentina or El Salvador, wherever else. And I think that's extremely important, but I think we've also been put to a challenge, and a really valid one, by quantitative scholars who said, yes, but you have no systematic evidence. And what they mean by that is you don't have a large N data set that can actually tell us what the impact is, one way or the other, of what you do. Now, what that's meant is in the last 5 or 6 years, we've started to see more systematic quantitative work by people working on questions of accountability, trying to actually, as they say, test what the effects are. And this has been done through a number of different data sets, and I won't list them all now, although I'm happy to sort of explain them more, focusing on questions of the impact of one or more transitional justice measures, and sometimes they're testing one, sometimes they're testing several, on different kinds of outcomes, including peace or stability, and they define this in different ways, including human rights records, are human rights records actually improved, and including democracy records, right? So we're starting to see a lot more sort of systematic quantitative work in this area. The problem is that these quantitative studies, much like the qualitative studies before them, give us really divergent findings, right? So although they look a lot more systematic, the correlations that they're finding aren't always consistent, and this is in part because data sets are constructed in slightly different ways, because the dependent variable is different, because the independent variable is different. So if you put a number of these studies side by side, what you would find is, oh my God, I actually don't know, right? That is not a reassuring answer, right? To get lots more data and still not really be entirely sure. Is it actually a good idea to be doing these things if my goal is increased peace and stability, if my goal is improved democracy scale, if my goal is improved human rights record? So one of the challenges beyond that is not just that we're actually seeing findings that vary a lot. So for example, one set of studies says that having more transitional justice measures improves democracy and human rights, period, right? One measure is good, 2 or 3 are even better, right? That sounds great. Like if I'm a policymaker, I might want to hear that. That sounds like something I can do. The problem is that there's another study that says, well, actually any of these measures alone or in confluence actually can make things worse unless you also have amnesties, right? If I'm a policymaker, I say, well, I don't know what to do now, because in fact, also we know that blanket amnesties are no longer permissible in UN-sanctioned peace agreements for the core international crimes. So being told that an amnesty might help is actually not a helpful thing to know in some cases, right? Just to give you one example. Other research has found that truth commissions in general actually have a negative correlation with peace and stability. This is not an encouraging finding. And still more find really, really negligible improved records, but they also say, look, these are barely of statistical significance. So what do you make of that, right? So, and last but not least, one of the big challenges, and I think something that sometimes gets lost in the translation from academic work to policy claims, is that these are at best correlations, right? So even if the correlations are true and we could actually find some systematic evidence, we wouldn't necessarily know what's causing what, right? Because of endogeneity problems and lots of other issues. And so we might still not be very confident that we could say, having this mechanism or this mechanism will actually help you improve your democracy record. It could be that something else is going on, right? Your democracy record was already actually not as bad as we thought because you had an independent judiciary. So it's not trials that caused an improved democracy or human rights record, it's the fact that you had an independent judiciary already. This is the argument I sometimes make about Colombia, right? A country that's undergone more than 50 years of civil war, egregious abuses, very serious ongoing issues, but which has a pretty independent constitutional court, which is part of why we've seen the accountability measures that we have there. Right, so you actually then have to drill down into individual countries again to say, well, what's causing what, right? Because even if I've got a good correlation, I don't necessarily know why, right? So these are some of the big challenges that then come when we start to try and think about evidence, right? And what does that mean? And what I think is challenging there is that what we really want, I think both as scholars, but also as policymakers, is to be able to say, yes, I think I can say with some reasonable amount of certainty that if you actually have this kind of trial process, it will actually help you in your rule of law reconstruction. Right? I'd love to be able to say that. I think we'd all love to be able to hear that. We don't have that evidence really clearly yet. So, and how am I doing on time? I'm on to final observations. Good, okay. So in terms of final observations, again, I think I've already really alluded to this. I wish it were possible to offer really concrete systematic findings which could directly help in developing programming that would enable us to both address mass atrocities and serious human rights violations and to promote peace and development at the same time. But I would say that both qualitative and quantitative evidence were not there yet. And I think what I would say, just by way of closing, and this may feel a little bit weak or frustrating, but I prefer that and being truthful to anything else, is that what we do know, and I think we know it better and better, is that there is an intimate link between conflict resolution, peace building, development, mass atrocities, and human rights violations. And that in itself is really important to know so that we're asking the right questions, right? If you're actually pursuing an accountability agenda, you're asking, how does what I do actually interface with what this peace-building actor is doing, what this development actor is doing, in terms of rule of law promotion, in terms of security sector reform, potentially in terms of disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of ex-combatants, right? And similarly, if you're working on a particular kind of peace-building agenda or peace-building program, you might want to be asking yourself, what happens when I pursue this DDR program in this country, in this context? How is that actually going to impact on modalities of accountability, right? So I think in a sense what we need to do is to keep reminding ourselves of this kind of interconnectedness, as well as the fact that although we need more systematic evidence, context matters as well, right? The particular country and its constraints matter a great deal in terms of what the possible is. And so we need to continue to attend to that in all these contexts. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. And I apologize, I think I didn't get a warning or I didn't see it. I went on longer than I meant to. Sorry about that.
Thank you. That's covered quite a lot of ground there.
Should I keep this on or not?
Yeah, keep that on, if you would, yeah. Any questions or any points that people want to make in response to anything that you've heard? Nick,
yeah. Nick Lamierba from IDB here, International Development Department. I'm interested in the new wave of human rights activism, the one that is led, for instance, by the Code Blue campaign right now, trying to leak internal documents in the UN when there's a sexual misconduct by peacekeepers, by UN peacekeepers, and the IGDH as well, so the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, which is currently suing the UN for having brought Haiti. Yeah, so in 2 weeks' time, it's going to be the 5th anniversary of this tragedy which killed 8,000 Haitians. I'm just wondering, what is your take on this kind of shifting of the agenda of accountability and mass and human rights violations, not just happening out there locally, and so accountability as something that needs to be enforced from the international point of view, but also basically including us in the question as well, including us as international actors, us as also people interested in these questions, so as individuals. So I'm just wondering if you see this as related a little bit to your talk and to the current kind of changing agenda.
I mean, I think you're pointing at two things. I'll start with the one that's maybe broader and come to the specific. The first thing is that I think, for much of the time as I've been speaking, I haven't specified who the violators are, right? And who the abusers are. This is partly because traditionally, because of the state-centric nature of international law, we have focused primarily on obligations of states, right? Increasingly clearly, we understand that in the context of armed conflict, internal or international, you're dealing with violations that are also committed by non-state actors. So the first thing is we actually do need to be a lot more explicit about, again, who we're holding responsible. That brings me to your specific question. And here you've got a real problem, because here you've got the problem of basic privileges and immunities of the United Nations, right? And more generally, of quite a few other international organizations. And this is a fundamental fact of international law. I'm not making a normative claim on behalf of it, but it is something that's very difficult to work around. So I take your point about the idea that advocates can do other things, right? By, as you say, leaking information, by engaging in different kinds of advocacy campaigns. But the challenge is that it isn't possible to actually bring criminal suit unless the state itself wants to do so, right? The state of the sending country. Right. So we have seen this in terms of abuses by peacekeepers in a number of cases. Cases have been brought in the Netherlands and Canada and so on. And we've also seen situations where countries can be shamed into having to remove their peacekeepers. But at the moment, accountability doesn't really go beyond that. Right? If the state doesn't want to act, the most you can do is say, you no longer have the human rights record to be allowed to participate in either this peacekeeping operation or any peacekeeping operation. There's really no other release valve. And I can see that that's frustrating, and I can only return to the point of that's a fact of international law that obviously there's been a great deal of discussion about because it seems so outrageous, particularly in the context of peacekeepers where you think they're meant to be there to protect people, right? It seems particularly ridiculous, but Unfortunately, that's the structure of things, which is why, again, different kinds of campaigns have tried to find other ways of preventing repetition.
Thanks. Louis, back.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Sriram. I've been meaning to ask you if you could elaborate on a critique that you did probably about 4 or 5 years ago. You began writing about which you defined as a trend in transitional justice of seeing things through the optic of dilemmas. So you talk about the justice versus peace dilemma or the truth versus justice dilemma within these debates. And the reason why I would like to hear a bit about this critique is because I'm from Colombia, and right now we're having a big justice versus peace dilemma in media and society, and I think it's a problem. It's an obstruction towards these sort of processes.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably only time for a short answer because the long answer is the complexity of reality. But the short answer is that these kinds of dichotomies actually aren't very helpful, right? They presume that it really is all or nothing, that it's a zero-sum game. You can have one or the other, or that one will inevitably so damage the other that you've got to make very serious moral compromises. And I do think frequently there are practical and moral compromises that get made. But I would say that there are lots of examples where you can find convergences. And I would say, and you should feel free to disagree with me, that Colombia is actually an interesting example of sort of accidentally finding some compromises. And I'm not sure they've all worked, but if you think about the way in which the DDR process has converged with reparations, has converged with truth-telling, has converged with accountability, albeit quite limited prosecutions, that's a pretty good example of actually saying, well, you can run all of these things simultaneously, albeit, yes, with all kinds of other problems. So I think part of what I've been trying to get at, and I think many people in the field have been trying to get at more and more, is let's stop talking about this as though it's one thing or the other. This, I think, is an artifact of the fact that we like to think in dichotomies, but also the fact, as I alluded to earlier, that we come from different communities, right? So people who do conflict resolution and peace building tend to come from a certain kind of political science training, and I come from that training too. And people who do human rights and accountability oftentimes come from legal backgrounds. I come from that background too, right? So I'm just schizophrenic. But the point is that actually you do need more of that conversation, or you do end up with these kinds of dichotomous arguments where you're just talking past each other.
Garrett?
Yeah. Thanks, Garrett Wall of the IDC. I'm not a specialist in conflict type thing, like services, but first of all, what's the role of reconciliation in general?
Yeah.
And just this, and the second is just to say a little bit about the gender dimensions. I think in passing this is a massive topic, but the same briefing. I guess finally the other thing is just that what kind of thing do you think a master's could do if they were looking at this sort of area, maybe for a dissertation they might look at doing in conference time to think about a piece of work.
Okay, in terms of truth and reconciliation commissions, obviously they come in such myriad forms, and therefore there are a lot of different kinds of claims. The one most people are most familiar with is, of course, the South African Commission. I mean, clearly they have a lot of different goals, and they do them better or less well depending on the country and the context, right? So, for example, the Sierra Leonean Truth Commission did what most people agree was a really fantastic job compiling a report that really got into the domestic sources of conflict, the regional sources of conflict, the economic dimension, the multiplicity of types of responsibility. It's really actually, it's not perfect, none of these reports are, but it's really quite good. But a lot of people who actually, observed the proceedings said, but the problem was it was really off-putting to the victims who went to testify. Right? The actual process was overly legalized, didn't make sense to them. Perpetrators really were allowed to smirk their way through the process. Again, there are different narratives, but so there are different understandings, but the claims are very much, again, that they give you a record of the truth. They potentially name perpetrators so that they can't go out and do it again because everyone knows who they are. They provide some kind of indication for victims. So there are a lot of different claims, but again, these processes do them better or less well. I mentioned Sri Lanka, the Lessons Learned in Reconciliation Commission, which I think most people agree was set up in a way that was not designed to do any of those things particularly well, bizarrely actually had some quite good recommendations, right? And so you can end up with quite surprisingly good recommendations from quite what I would say was a deliberately flawed institution. So it's very hard to say from the outset. In terms of gender, yes, I'm terrible because I failed to talk about it really seriously at all. And it's hard to know where to begin, in a sense, because obviously when you're dealing with questions of peace and conflict resolution, alongside human rights abuses, you cannot help but be aware of the widespread problem of sexual violence and armed conflict and the very limited ways in which responses ever happen, right? And many of these happen only later through, for example, as was the case in Sierra Leone, in some cases, medical reconstruction, where you have very serious harm committed, very limited trauma counseling, those kinds of things. And this comes alongside problematic gender dimensions more generally in peacekeeping and peace building. Historically, that even where you've got a significant number of female combatants, they often don't go through the DDR process for a whole host of reasons. Presumptions by international actors, prevention by their own commanders, so on and so forth. And what that means is they end up falling into the category of victims, even though they may have been much more than that. And victims tend to get reparations much, much later than people who go through a DDR process get their DDR packages, right? So there tends to be a sort of compound effect. I could also go on about gendered elements of reparations, but I think we're gonna run out of time. Gosh, in terms of what a master's student can do in the context of one thesis, I mean, pick a topic, any topic, and you'll find that while there's loads written, much of it will be frustrating and contradictory, and you can pick almost anything that looks like conventional wisdom and say, well, wait a minute, that's not right, right? So, I mean, to come back to gender and reparations, just to make it easy, for a long time, the argument was, well, look, you know, finally we're giving reparations to women, and they can go and start their own business and so on. So, what that overlooked was that in many cases, women are embedded in societies where male members of the family will simply take that money if it's a cash payout, or they themselves hand it over because they think it's their social obligation, right? So simply saying, here's $100 of reparations doesn't turn out to be that helpful. So it's that kind of thing of like, you know, just sort of drilling down any topic that interests you. If you look at the conventional wisdom and then you start to ask, well, wait, but how does that work in context? There's always more there. I don't know if that helps.
Other questions here?
Yeah. Nancy, where do peace agreements by regional bodies fit in? Sometimes like in East Africa or the Gulf Cooperation Council in Yemen, they seem to, when conflict flares up, move in. It's our region, we'll do it, and then it doesn't work. And then you have a big mess. Where do these agreements sit in international law?
Well, I mean, peace agreements, regardless, have a really complex status in international law because so many of them are now between states and non-state armed groups. So they don't have the status of treaties and conventions for a start. People like Christine Bell have argued that they may or may not have something like the status of constitutional settlements, even if they haven't actually generated a new constitution. And that would be true regardless of who the mediators are. Now, it is true that mediators operate with different mandates, and they also get recognized differently in different processes in terms of how they're viewed by the UN Security Council in terms of its mandate for international peace and security. So, for example, if we think about the ECOMOG intervention, so by ECOWAS in Sierra Leone, we know that that was endorsed by the UN Security Council. Now, I'm talking about a peacekeeping mission here, not a specific peace process, but I think the same points apply. That in a sense, we need to assess the validity based on the content of the process, but then also by the level of recognition by bodies such as the United Nations, particularly the Security Council. But that does leave us with a dilemma, right? There will be many peace agreements, some of which actually hold, or political settlements, some of which actually hold, which have content that actually we're not terribly thrilled about, right? Because they will permit amnesties that may or may not be consistent with the rules that the UN now sets for its own mediators. Clearly there, what that means is that those rules apply for the parties as insofar as they want to engage with them. Those rules, so any agreement, for example, if there were an amnesty in a settlement brokered by IGAD, the International Criminal Court wouldn't have to respect it. This would not have any legally binding status. It might have domestic legal binding status within a country itself, but it would not have any relevance for the ICC. Does that make sense? Okay.
Can I ask a question about evidence, which is, of course, in the GSDRC, we're interested in communicating evidence, and I was, you talked about how the evidence on the the efficacy of these kinds of interventions to support rule of law is scarce, is contradictory. It's also, I guess, politically loaded, and in situations where you're dealing with this, highly emotive and divisive. So I guess sort of two questions. One is, how do you go about trying to communicate lessons and evidence to people who might be in positions to be implementing interventions? And second, do you think that policymakers and practitioners are actually influenced by the evidence, or are they more strongly influenced by other factors around? And what is the role of the evidence in really creating or helping to develop policy and implement support to rule of law?
So how to communicate lessons and evidence? I mean, I would back up one step and say, it's not that there's thin evidence, it's that we've got a lot of data and we've yet to figure out how to manage it in a way that we can analyze properly. And I don't know precisely what that answer is, right? I think that continues to be a big question, both of quantitative and qualitative analysis. But in terms of communicating, I guess one of the things that I would always highlight is where I finished, which is the question of context specificity and asking the right questions. So I tend to lean towards not, I can tell you with some degree of certainty that if you have a truth commission, it's going to help you to achieve these goals around rule of law or anything else. But rather, if you're thinking about having a truth commission, here are some of the modalities which may help you engage in different ways with different goals, and here are some of the risks. And I know that's messy, that's also the world, but that's the way I tend to want to communicate these things, is really a sort of what to watch out for. What should you be asking yourself when you go into a situation and you're trying to pursue all these goals simultaneously? So that's the first thing. The second thing, are policymakers influenced by evidence? I don't really know how to answer that, because obviously everyone says that they want evidence-based for, in fact, their programming, and they want to be able to test it against it. So no one's going to tell you I ignore the evidence, I don't think. How meaningful it is and how much, again, some of the predispositions which come from which community of practitioners you're actually in influences how you understand the evidence that's given to you, I don't know. That's probably a subject not for a master's thesis perhaps, but more generally an important subject to be examined. I have to say that I worked for a think tank for some years that worked, the UN was our only client. We were based in New York and dealt mostly with headquarters. And I had very mixed responses from people. Some people said, look, when I see a big statistical study, I now know that you've given me science, you've given me truth. And I had other people who said, this looks like absolute gibberish. Tell me a story that I can understand, right? So, I mean, I think there's no straight answer to that. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we have time for maybe one or more. Yeah.
I just wondered if you could speak to the idea of, I suppose, the cultural legitimacy in transitional justice process. And I'm thinking of examples such as Rwanda and Uganda, where the kind of Gacaca processes of Matarapo were kind of co-opted and sort of localized processes but imposed externally, and how they kind of have functioned.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a real challenge, because all of the practices that I've been talking about and the way in which I've been talking about them have been very top-down driven, right, by international actors, i.e. courts or the UN or the EU, so on and so forth. And there's been significant pushback. This is true in peace building, this is true in development, this is true in transitional justice, real arguments about local ownership, right? And the relationship between this abstract thing that we sometimes call Planet Hague, doing justice for you, and actually, you know, having something that's a meaningful thing that does justice in a way that's locally comprehensible. And I think rightly, there's been a lot of soul searching across all of these fields, and a lot of push to try and say, okay, how can we actually engage local processes, whether it's Mataoput or Gacaca, whether it's different kinds of understanding of local provision of justice, and conflict resolution. And I think all of those are good things with a big caveat, right? And I think you've pointed to it. One is co-optation, or possibly power claims that sort of overwhelm what a local reality might be. Whether it's the way in which Gacaca was reshaped to become a highly administrative process driven by the Rwandan government, or the ways in which Mataoput became asserted as an authentic practice for all of northern Uganda, when in fact what was happening is it was being asserted by certain Acholi leaders. to be a practice that was valid for all of northern Uganda, not the same thing. So we need to be really sensitive to the power dynamics in these kinds of contexts. I think we also need to be quite sensitive to the fact that this thing that we call culture or tradition is fluid, right? And in fact, also that conflict really highly disrupts a lot of what we think of as tradition in communities. People get displaced, traditional leaders get sort of delegitimated for a whole host of reasons. So simply thinking that we can sort of reestablish a thing, which is sometimes what it looks like, may be sort of wide of the mark. And the last thing, and of course I would say this, is that many practices are actually simply inconsistent with core international human rights. Right, and so we can negotiate and we can adjust up to a point, but those of us outside who are wanting to say we want to defend human rights or promote human rights start to get a little bit uncomfortable when we want to say, but for the sake of authenticity, we ought to have this process that involves chewing on a root that may kill you, right? I mean, I think we really want to think about that. So I think, I'm sorry, I'm not giving you an answer of what we should do, but it's just sort of my rambling response to, I think, the issues.
Perhaps one last question, if somebody has anything they want to say. Back to you then for the last word.
In your presentation, like the instruments or the possibilities, transitional justice, you mentioned memorialization. And I want to ask you a very complex question. Do you have evidence or do you have cases where memorials lead to reconciliation? Because I studied Bosnia, and in certain areas, period of and it also in cultural, the establishment of memorials leads to a clash because of the application. So I see the other side, but I'd like to hear more on the positive cases, perhaps.
So actually, here's a great study for a master's student. I would say memorials is one of the big understudied areas of transitional justice. They tend to get lumped in with the rest of restorative justice. So we've looked at reparations and lots of things like that a lot more. And so I would tend to agree with you that there will be many situations in which memorials themselves can be conflict generating, not necessarily violent, but generate all kinds of dispute because they become assertions about who harmed whom in many cases, or they become in some cases also artificial assertions of we are now a community, right? And I'm not convinced that either of those is terribly effective. It's really unclear to me where, if at all, memorials have generated reconciliation. You get anecdotal stories here and there, and I think also one of the ongoing questions is, what do we mean by reconciliation, and what's our time frame for talking about it, right? So first of all, I'm not sure we've ever had a particularly enlightening definition of reconciliation, but this is my personal problem. And second, I would say, even if we figured out what it was, we shouldn't be shocked to expect that we wouldn't see it for decades. Right, because we are talking about some form of social accommodation, change in understanding, and a lot of other things that are just far too nuanced, and social change is slow. So I don't know if that is at all helpful. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You've taken us through quite a lot of varied territory, and the follow-up to this will be Professor Sriram is writing up a short briefing note that is connected to all of this, that is going to be published later on the GSDRC website. Again, part of this professional development work for DFID. So you'll be able to see sort of a condensed set of notes about all of this quite soon, I think. Thank you very much for coming to speak with us.
Thanks. Sorry, I went on longer than I thought. I really would have started skipping had I realized. But I'm so sorry. I did look a couple of times, but I realized you were in my blind spot, and I have to say,
It's very hard to see.
Yeah.